because we've just started, and the book, of course, contains the membership list of the Council and the Trilateral Commission in the back of the book. It's quite instructive for anybody to read, and we recommend it, of course. All right, now, I want to talk to you about the Rhodes Scholar Program. I think it's very significant, and it is significant mainly, even more so, because Mr. Clinton is a graduate of the Rhodes Scholar Program, as are several senators and a lot of other high-powered individuals in our country. And Mr. Clinton, in his speech accepting the Democrat nomination last summer, indicated that the man who started him on his road to what he calls the New Covenant was one of his history professors at Georgetown University. Now, here's what he said. Here's what Mr. Clinton said in the middle of his acceptance speech at the Democratic Convention. As a teenager, I heard John Kennedy's summons to citizenship, and then as a student, I heard that call clarified by a professor I had named Carroll Quigley. Carroll Quigley. That's the man we want to talk about for a few moments here. Remember that Mr. Clinton graduated from Georgetown University right here in Washington, D.C. And he was influenced, obviously, by this Professor Quigley. Now, who was Carroll Quigley? Carroll Quigley, a professor at Georgetown. He had earned 3 degrees from Harvard during the 1930s. He taught at Harvard, then at Princeton. He began his 28-year career at Georgetown University, School of Foreign Service, in 1941. He became the instructor of numerous former diplomats and government officials. In 1966, New York's Macmillan Company, the publishers, released his 1,300-page book called Tragedy and Hope. Until the book was discovered by opponents of what has become known as the Communist Conspiracy or the New World Order, it didn't attract very much attention except in academic circles. It went to a lot of libraries, but then it was read by somebody who put us onto it, and we became very interested in Tragedy and Hope. Why? The book documented the existence of a powerful international network, is what Quigley called it, whose goal was, quote, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. That's page 324 in Professor Quigley's book. Now, we already believed that such a scheme was underway, and it was quite interesting to find somebody talking about it in a book published by an establishment publisher. What's interesting about it is that Mr. Quigley, Professor Quigley, I shouldn't call him Mr., he's Doctor, he was not condemning it. He was praising it. He thought it was wonderful. He went on to say that I've known of the operations of this network because I studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years to examine its papers and secret records. My chief disagreement with it is that it wishes to remain secret, and I think it should be more well known. That's what he said. All right? So he didn't believe it was a conspiracy. A conspiracy is a secret plot to do evil. If it's a secret plot to do something you think is good, then you can say, well, it's nasty to keep it secret, but it's not a conspiracy because it's not evil. In his mind, this was wonderful. He thought it fine. He instructed all of his students about this. And the book was available to Mr. Clinton during his years at Georgetown. I'm sure if you had a professor at Georgetown who had just written a book, he probably would have told you about it if you were one of his students. In fact, he might have demanded of you that you read it. All right? Bill Clinton graduated in 1968. The book came out in 1966. Now, Quigley pointed to England's Oxford University and its professor John Ruskin and his star pupil Cecil John Rhodes as the intellectual originators of the network. I call it a plot. And I should tell you right now that before he died, Quigley, too, called it a plot. The idea was, and I quote again, to federate the English-speaking peoples and to bring all the habitable portions of the world under their control. All right? Now, I'm not opposed to having the English dominate the world just because I'm an Irish American. That's not my only motivation. I'm opposed to it because I don't think anybody should dominate the world. I'm for less government. I'm for more responsibility amongst the people, which I think, with God's help, will lead to a better world. So, Cecil John Rhodes was a student of Ruskin. Cecil John Rhodes then became a fabulously wealthy individual. He went on, with the help of the Rothschild banking empire, to amass a large fortune from the diamond and gold mines in southern Africa. And according to Quigley, he, quote, left part of his fortune to found the Rhodes Scholarships at Oxford to train young students for the secret society. And he did call it, on many occasions, a secret society, something they formed in 1891. Quigley also reported, again I'm quoting, in 1909 through 1913, they organized semi-secret groups known as the Round Table Groups. In 1919, they founded the Royal Institute of International Affairs. That's from England. Similar institutes of international affairs were established in the chief British dominions and in the United States, where it is known as the Council on Foreign Relations. And these were established in the period 1919 to 1927. In America, those who belong to this network are generally referred to as the establishment. The headquarters of the establishment in the United States is the Council on Foreign Relations, 58 East 68th Street, New York City, a private organization, 2,900 members who dominate this country. And the John Birch Society would like to have more people know about it. Now, along the way, Quigley became aware of the fact that what he called the radical right, that's us, the extremists, as I mentioned to you, the radical right, he said there does exist and has existed for a generation an international Anglophile network which operates to some extent in the way the radical right believes the communists act. Well, I should tell you at this point that yes, we were opposed to communism and we thought it was a horror show, and I don't think anybody would disagree today. But we also said that there was a conspiracy operating above communism, and that this conspiracy above communism was financing it and dignifying it and getting tax dollars from the American people to send to it, and that our government was involved in this, and we pointed to those involved in propping up communism and keeping them in business and building them into a world power as they did. We referred to those people as the insiders, which is why my little book is called The Insiders. The insiders are what we called that group. Quigley called them a secret network, and it's all the same people. Quigley described the networks behind-the-scenes plotting to bring about the Federal Reserve. Its worry when a congressional committee began to investigate the huge tax-exempt foundations, even the Council on Foreign Relations, the Reese Committee, 1953 and 54. And the threat posed by, to the plotters by other congressional investigations. Now, Bill Clinton studied under Quigley, became a Rhodes Scholar, and has been a member of the network's Council on Foreign Relations for several years. He's also a member of the Trilateral Commission, which Quigley knew nothing about because he had died before the Trilateral Commission had been formed after he wrote his book. The Clinton Program for America, which unfortunately very much resembles CFR veteran George Bush's Program for America, follows the Rhodes, Ruskin, Council on Foreign Relations, Quigley blueprint. It includes the domination of the political life of the entire world by a powerful few. And if you don't believe that conclusion, I suggest you read Quigley. 1,350 pages of it. It's all there. Now, when the John Birch Society began to point to this book as corroboration for the view that we had arrived at through circumstantial evidence, all of a sudden the Macmillan Company would no longer publish the book. Quigley was anxious for it to be read, and he was even earning royalties from every copy that was sold. And so after a time, people were being told it's out of print. Quigley found out about that, and he called up Macmillan, and he said to Macmillan, please, republish my book. There's still a demand. And they said, well, if we get 1,000 more, then we'll publish some more. They got many more than 1,000. They never published any more. Quigley began to smell a rat, as they say. And then there was a pirated edition published somewhere in the Far East. The entire book was published without Macmillan's permission. And Quigley heard about that, and Quigley was very upset about that because he wasn't getting anything out of that. He wasn't getting a royalty from it. Macmillan continued to refuse to publish the book. Then Quigley met and became friendly with a man who had received similar treatment, a man named Edward Hunter, an expert on psychological warfare, the man who in fact coined the term brainwashing. He had testified before congressional committees back in the early 50s at the end of the Korean War about the way our prisoners of war had acted in Korean prison camps. And Edward Hunter had himself a book that was published, and when it became too important for the American people to understand what was happening, at least in that small area, his book was no longer available in print either. And Edward Hunter began to explain to Carroll Quigley that this thing that he talked about here really wasn't so wonderful after all. And before he died in 1977, Carroll Quigley very much indicated that he was of that opinion himself. All right, so we've gone a long way around the barn here to get back to the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission. The Council on Foreign Relations grew out of this Anglophile network started by Cecil John Rhodes in the late 1800s. The actual founding of it is interesting. It occurred in 1919. The thinking behind it became dominant when American delegates to the Versailles Treaty at the end of World War I were meeting in Paris, and they got word via cablegram that the United States Senate had just turned thumbs down on our entry into the the League of Nations. They debated the matter for 9 months and voted, I think it was 45 to 36 against our entry into what these individuals wanted, the beginning of a world government organization. And so our senators said no, and they voted against. Well, over in Paris, here was the American delegation led by Edward Mandell House, President Wilson's chief advisor, the man who had written a book in 1912, as I mentioned, saying, I'm working for socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. He was very disappointed, and so were those who were with him, who helped him to found the Council on Foreign Relations in America, John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, Sumner Wells, Walter Lippmann, and others amongst them, some of whom were present in Paris, some of whom were not. Immediately upon hearing that the United States was not going to get into the League of Nations, they got together with their British counterparts, and the British formed the Royal Institute for International Affairs. The Americans formed the Council on Foreign Relations. They brought it back to our country. It was finally incorporated, and it began in 1921, as I've said. The purpose, right from the beginning, was to establish a world government. Now, if you start a world government, what becomes of the Declaration of Independence? If you have America join this world government, what becomes of the Constitution of the United States that limits government so dramatically as it has never before been limited in all history? Well, they both have to be scrapped. If you're going to have a world government, you can't have independent nations, and you can't have one nation saying government shall be limited so strictly. We've got to have a world organization. And that's what they were for right from the beginning. Now, a couple of years ago, a man in the John Birch Society decided to do a lot of research, a lot more than had ever been done about this Council on Foreign Relations. And so we went to a big city library that had all of the publications of the council going back to the 20s. And he read through them all. And at the end of that, he wrote a book called The Shadows of Power, The Council on Foreign Relations and the American Decline. And he indicted them with their own words. The Council on Foreign Relations would tell us that they're just a debating organization, and yet they stated from the beginning that their goal was world government. Sometimes people say to us, has there ever been anybody from the Council who has come out of it to tell us what they actually intended to do? And the answer is yes. Yes, there was a man named Admiral Chester Ward. And Admiral Chester Ward had been a member of the Council on Foreign Relations for about 20 years. He had been the Judge Advocate General of the United States Navy. He was not an insignificant person. And Admiral Ward co-authored a book in 1974, I think it was. And in it, he said exactly what we have always said. He wrote, quote, "This lust to surrender the sovereignty and independence of the United States is pervasive throughout most of the membership. In the entire CFR lexicon, there is no term of revulsion carrying a meaning so deep as America First." What's the matter with America First, my friends? As long as it does not trample on somebody else's rights or somebody else's property, there's nothing wrong with wanting your own nation to be first, to be the best. But the Council on Foreign Relations didn't want that. Nor did Cecil John Rhodes, nor did Carroll Quigley for a time, and nor do people who are members of the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, not every one of them is a conspirator. In fact, our attitude about the 2,900 members of the Council on Foreign Relations is that very few of them are conspirators, and most of them are just going along because it means that they can rub elbows with the high and the mighty, and that they can be seen, and that they can get promotions, and that their ideas can be dignified, and they can get op-ed pieces in the New York Times and the Washington Post and on and on. Both of those publications and many others, of course, led by people who are members of the Council on Foreign Relations. So the Shadows of Power indicts the Council not from what somebody else said, but from what the Council itself has said. And we have sent this book to many members of the Council on Foreign Relations, and I don't think we've gotten back anybody who has said, "You're telling lies about us." It's a very important book. The Trilateral Commission I mentioned came along in 1973, formed by David Rockefeller, who at the time was the chairman of the board of the Council on Foreign Relations, and Zbigniew Brzezinski, a member of its board of directors. And again, let me say that the Trilateral Commission emphasizes the economic. The Council on Foreign Relations emphasizes the political. The Council on Foreign Relations, all U.S. citizens. Trilateral Commission, Western Europe, North America, and Japan. Robert Welsh, the founder of the John Birch Society, warned Americans who would listen about the New World Order as much as 30 years ago, by name. He even said that the slogan of this conspiracy, as he believed it to be, as I do, the slogan is Novus Ordo Seclorum, which is freely translated New World Order and literally means New Order of the Ages. And going back over 25 years, we knew that that was their goal and that that was their phrase. In 1974, a very prominent member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a man named Richard Gardner, wrote a book in their journal. Their journal is called Foreign Affairs. If you've ever seen a copy of Foreign Affairs, it's usually very thick. They publish them 5 times a year. And articles about internationalism, domestic politics, all kinds of things in there, usually by members of the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, the article that I'm referring to appeared in the summer of 1974, written by Richard Gardner, a member of the Council, a former State Department official, a man who was a professor at Columbia University then and is again and still now. The article was called "The Hard Road to World Order." All right, and what did he say in that article? He said, "We are working to perform an end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece." And that's a quote, my friends. Eroding it piece by piece. Scrap that Declaration of Independence. Scrap that Constitution. We are on the hard road to world order. I consider that treason. Treason to the country that I was born into and have grown to love more and more every year as the years pile up for me. And so we see that President Bush started talking about the New World Order. The others hadn't done it explicitly, except a few of them, like Gardner and like a few others. President Bush, over and over again, every time he mentioned the term the New World Order, he also talked about the United Nations. Over and over again, he said things like, "Out of these troubled times, our fifth objective, a new world order, can emerge. We are now in sight of a United Nations that performs as envisioned by its founders." That was the Bush message over and over again during the Persian Gulf crisis, during the war that was unleashed against Iraq. He said, when we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders. Founders. Who were the founders of the United Nations? Well, go back to the U.S. delegation, and you find men like Alger Hiss and 15 others who were later identified as communists, unquestionably. Alger Hiss was the first Secretary General of the United Nations until they appointed the first permanent Secretary General. He was the Secretary General of the founding conference, and he was a communist. Did he have in mind preserving the Constitution of the United States and the Declaration of Independence? Of course not. He was in favor of the United Nations. Amongst the American delegation at the founding conference for the United Nations, the founders, as Mr. Bush continually refers to them, we find 34 members of the Council on Foreign Relations. And that's at a time when they had fewer than 2,000 members. They now have 2,900. Over and over again, the New World Order and the United Nations. The United Nations also was formed, of course, by a delegation from Russia, from the Soviet Union, headed by Andrei Gromyko. He was a communist. I don't have to stop and tell anybody that. Everybody knows it. But Mr. Bush never told us what he intended. What did he mean by the New World Order? And reporters would go to the White House and try to find out, what do you mean, Mr. President? Well, finally, after the Persian Gulf War had been settled, a reporter from the Los Angeles Times went. He wrote an article, and it appeared nationwide. This actually appeared in the Milwaukee Journal, A New World Order, Bush's Vision Still Fuzzy. And out of the White House came this. One August morning in Kennebunkport, Maine, Bush took his National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, for a ride on the presidential speedboat Fidelity. 4 hours later, the president came ashore with a ringing slogan that Scowcroft had offered, the New World Order. And so we're supposed to believe that they dreamed it up in August of 1990 on a speedboat ride off Kennebunkport, Maine. But I have a big problem with that, and my problem is that for 25 years, every time I saw the phrase New World Order, I just simply grabbed it and I threw it in a file. I didn't know whether it would ever become useful or not. It certainly did become useful. And so we put together a little booklet out of my file. And some of the examples, here's a man who wrote a book in 1920 called The New World Order, calling for internationalism. Here's a socialist from England named H.G. Wells, wrote a book in 1940 called The New World Order. Here's Nelson Rockefeller speaking in in Washington, published in a Utah paper. Goal of Rockefeller, a new world order. President Nixon went to Red China in 1972, and he toasted Chu Enlai, and he said, what brings us together? The hope that each of us has to build a new world order, and there's the UPI release quoting that. And on we go. This phrase has been used for generations by individuals who want socialism and world government. Fidel Castro, 1979, demands new world order, and he did so at United Nations headquarters in New York City. Mikhail Gorbachev, 2 months before the speedboat ride, Gorbachev urges new world order, and there are lots of other clippings as well. My friends, for the White House to put out that business of them having developed this phrase on a speedboat ride is pure bunk. Kenny bunk, I guess you could say. And so what is the New World Order? Let me be very clear about this. 2 elements: political control and economic control. Political control through a world government, and if Mr. Bush has accomplished anything, he has enhanced the power of the United Nations, hasn't he? Which is to be a world government. Economic control is usually accomplished through socialism. And communism is a form of socialism. It was USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And the difference between a communist and a socialist, very easy. A communist is a socialist in a hurry. He means to impose socialism. An ordinary socialist, like the socialists that came out of England, the Fabian socialist movement, they mean to have you vote yourself into the condition. But what is socialism? Let me not presume. I'm not talking about sociability. I'm talking about socialism. Economic control. It means taxation, regulations, controls, bureaucracy, big brother government. And that is what we are being given by a succession of administrations here in the United States. And we are going to be given a lot more of it in the Clinton administration, if indeed Mr. Clinton can get his program through Congress. Part of the way of gaining economic control over all of us is through debt. When Ronald Reagan became president in 1981, the United States national debt was under $1 trillion. When George Bush left after 12 years of what they continued to tell me was conservative leadership, the debt was now $4.1 trillion. It had quadrupled during the administrations of 2 very conservative presidents, they tell me. I've frequently said it's a good thing we didn't elect a liberal. Now, we can blame Congress as well, and we certainly should. The president can offer a program. It's the Congress that goes ahead and appropriates the money or decides to go into debt. Let's break that down. 4.1 trillion. We've got 250 million people in this country. A little long division. What is it per person? It's $16,400. Each of you, $16,400. If you just go to tax-paying Americans, those who are working and paying taxes, then you're up to about $50,000 per person who pays taxes, your portion of the national debt. If you take that 4.1 trillion and you try to compute what would be the interest